There is a kind of conflict that does not leave visible scars, yet it exhausts you more than open war ever could dot. It is the conflict where nothing is said directly, yet everything is implied, where smiles conceal resentment, where agreement hides resistance, where silence becomes a weapon more precise than accusation. If you have ever left a conversation feeling unsettled without knowing exactly why, if you have ever questioned your own perception after someone calmly denied what you clearly sensed, if you have ever found yourself replaying words, tones, pauses long after the moment had passed, then this message is for you. Stay with me until the end, because what we are about to explore is not simply how to deal with passive-aggressive people. It is how to become so internally structured, so emotionally disciplined, so sovereign in your perception, that subtle hostility loses its power over you entirely. By the end of this discourse, you will not merely understand passive aggression. You will see it without fear, without confusion, and without surrendering your peace. And if at any moment you recognize a pattern in your own life, do not rush past it. Let it settle. Let it teach you. Subscribe now if you are serious about mastering the inner world, because this channel is not about motivation, it is about formation. And in the comments, write this quietly but deliberately: I refuse to be manipulated. Do not write it for others. Write it as a commitment to yourself. Now let us begin the deeper study. Part I. The quiet theater of conflict. There is a form of hostility that does not declare itself. It does not announce its arrival, nor does it present itself with the clarity of open opposition. It enters quietly, almost politely, and for that reason it is often misunderstood. It smiles, it agrees, it avoids direct confrontation, yet it leaves behind a subtle tension that lingers long after the conversation has ended. Many people fail to recognize this pattern at first. They sense discomfort, but cannot easily identify its source. They replay exchanges in their minds, searching for a specific word or phrase that might justify their unease. What unsettles them is not what was said, but what was implied. The hostility was not explicit. It was atmospheric. And because it was atmospheric, it is difficult to confront directly. The Stoics were acutely aware of this type of human dynamic. Although they wrote in a world very different from our own, they understood that not all conflict arrives openly. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire filled with political maneuvering, hidden resentments, veiled criticism, and subtle power plays. He did not imagine that his greatest threats would always stand in front of him with swords drawn. Often they sat beside him, speaking softly. What distinguished the Stoic from the reactive mind was not superior aggression, but superior perception. The Stoic did not ask, "How do I defeat this person?" He asked, "What is within my control in this situation?" And this question immediately changes the nature of the struggle. When dealing with passive-aggressive individuals, the instinctive response is emotional interpretation. A comment is made, perhaps lightly, perhaps with plausible deniability, and the mind begins its work. Was that meant as criticism? Was that directed at me? Am I being undermined? The more one attempts to interpret hidden meaning, the more energy is consumed by speculation. Epictetus warned against precisely this habit. He insisted that events themselves are neutral. It is our judgment about them that disturbs us. In the presence of passive aggression, the disturbance rarely comes from the external act alone. It comes from the internal narrative that forms around it. Consider a simple example. A colleague remarks, "I suppose some people prefer to do things their own way." The statement is ambiguous. It can be harmless. It can be pointed. The listener, however, feels the sting of implication and begins constructing an internal defense. Explanations are prepared. Justifications are rehearsed. Emotional energy is mobilized, yet nothing concrete has been accused. The Stoic would pause at this moment. He would not rush to defend himself against implication. He would not allow himself to be drawn into a battle against suggestion. Instead, he would narrow his attention to what has been explicitly stated. If there is a direct concern, it can be addressed directly. If there is only insinuation, it requires no pursuit. This is the first strategic distinction. The Stoic refuses to fight shadows. Shadows cannot be defeated because they lack substance. They exist only insofar as the mind animates them. By declining to animate them, the Stoic preserves his composure. This does not mean he is naive. It does not mean he fails to recognize hostility. It means he refuses to give it more reality than it possesses. Over time, many individuals trapped in passive-aggressive dynamics find themselves exhausted, not by overt attacks, but by constant vigilance. They scan tone. They analyze pauses. They scrutinize facial expressions. This hyperattention gradually erodes tranquility. The mind becomes a courtroom where every interaction is cross-examined. The Stoic closes that courtroom. He asks a simpler question. What precisely has been done or said? If there is something clear, it can be confronted calmly. If there is nothing clear, there is nothing to confront. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself not to imagine injuries where none had been declared. He understood that imagination magnifies minor slights into personal affronts. By disciplining perception, he disciplined emotion. At this stage, a common misunderstanding arises. Some believe that Stoicism demands emotional suppression, that one must feel nothing in order to remain calm. This is not the case. The Stoic feels irritation just as any person does. The difference lies in what he does next. He does not allow irritation to dictate behavior. He examines it, traces it to its source, and determines whether it is justified by facts or fueled by interpretation. Passive aggression feeds on reaction. It often seeks to provoke without appearing provocative. If the target reacts strongly, the aggressor can retreat into plausible innocence. "I didn't mean anything by it. You're overreacting." Thus the reactive person loses twice. First, by being disturbed, and second, by appearing unstable. The Stoic avoids this trap by slowing the tempo of his response. He understands that speed favors emotion, while delay favors reason. In moments of subtle provocation, he gives himself time, sometimes only a few seconds, to separate stimulus from judgment. It is in that space that sovereignty lives. Sovereignty is not dominance over others. It is authority over oneself. And in dealings with passive-aggressive individuals, self-authority is the only reliable form of control available. Before moving further, pause and reflect. Consider whether in your own life there are situations where ambiguity has unsettled you more than direct confrontation would have. Consider whether your exhaustion has come not from open conflict, but from mental speculation. If this reflection resonates, remain with it. The discipline of observation is the foundation of all Stoic strategy. In the next section, we will move deeper into the psychological roots of passive aggression, not to excuse it, but to understand it and explore how understanding transforms emotional reaction into measured strength. Part 2, on fear, avoidance, and the architecture of indirect power. If we are to understand how to remain steady in the presence of passive aggression, we must first understand what produces it, for it is tempting, dangerously tempting, to interpret all indirect hostility as malice. Yet Stoicism does not begin with accusation. It begins with examination. Marcus Aurelius, in his private reflections, repeatedly urged himself to consider the ignorance behind harmful behavior, not to excuse it, not to condone it, but to understand its origin. Whenever you are offended at someone's fault, he wrote, turn to yourself and reflect in what similar manner you do err. This was not self-blame. It was perspective. Passive aggression is rarely born from strength. It is born from fear, fear of direct confrontation, fear of rejection, fear of losing control, fear of exposure. Consider for a moment a scene. Two colleagues disagree about a project. One is comfortable with disagreement. The other is not. The second colleague avoids open discussion. Instead of voicing frustration directly, he delays tasks, withholds information subtly, makes small comments that question competence without stating so outright. He avoids saying, I disagree with your approach. He says, interesting. I suppose we'll see how that works out. On the surface, this is harmless. Beneath the surface, it is strategic. Why does he not speak plainly? Because plain speech risks conflict. It risks vulnerability. It risks being wrong. Indirect speech, however, allows deniability. If confronted, he can retreat. I didn't mean anything by it. This is the architecture of passive aggression. Control without accountability. The Stoic sees this clearly. He does not personalize it. He analyzes it. Once you begin to see passive aggression as avoidance rather than dominance, something shifts inside you. Your anger begins to dissolve, not into weakness, but into comprehension. The person who refuses clarity is not exercising power. He is avoiding exposure, and clarity is the language of the sea. Courageous. There is a profound difference between a person who confronts you openly and one who undermines you subtly. The first risks immediate tension. The second avoids tension while creating prolonged instability. The Stoic prefers tension to instability because tension can be resolved. Instability erodes. If this distinction is illuminating something in your own experience, pause for a moment. Reflect on whether the individuals who have unsettled you most were not the loudest critics, but the quietest insinuators. If this work is sharpening your perception, subscribe now. Not for entertainment, but for continued discipline of thought. Mastery requires repetition. Let us continue. Passive aggression often operates in environments where emotional maturity is underdeveloped. Families, workplaces, partnerships, anywhere communication is necessary but vulnerability is feared. These dynamics can emerge in such settings. The untrained mind becomes reactive. It attempts to decode hidden meanings, to anticipate indirect attacks, to defend against possibilities rather than realities. Over time, this hypervigilance becomes exhausting. Seneca warned against precisely this mental habit. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. In the presence of passive aggression, imagination can become a relentless amplifier. A delayed reply becomes rejection. A short answer becomes hostility. A neutral comment becomes veiled criticism. The Stoic disciplines this amplification. He does not assume innocence blindly, nor does he assume guilt prematurely. He waits for evidence. This waiting is not passivity. It is strength under control. There is an ancient image often used in Stoic metaphor, the inner citadel, a fortified place within the mind where judgment is examined before being accepted. When subtle hostility appears, the Stoic retreats briefly into this citadel. He asks, what has actually occurred? What am I adding to it? Is my reaction proportionate to fact or to assumption? This pause may last only seconds, but it changes everything. In many passive-aggressive dynamics. Escalation occurs not because of the original act, but because of the reaction to interpretation. One partner says, "It's fine." The other hears, "You disappointed me." The first insists nothing is wrong. The second insists something is wrong. Conflict escalates around an invisible accusation. Had either paused to request clarity calmly without accusation, the fog might have lifted. The Stoic therefore practices what we might call disciplined inquiry. Instead of defending against implication, he invites precision. If something concerns you, I would prefer to address it directly. Notice the tone, not aggressive, not pleading, not sarcastic, simply firm. This firmness is not theatrical. It is rooted in self-respect. And here is an important truth. Passive aggression often weakens in the presence of consistent clarity. It thrives on ambiguity. It survives an implication. It feeds on overreaction. When met repeatedly with calm requests for specificity, it either transforms into direct communication or reveals itself as unwilling. To mature. Both outcomes provide valuable information. If this reflection is prompting you to reconsider certain dynamics in your life, do not rush past the discomfort. Growth rarely feels dramatic. It feels clarifying. And if you are committed to building this kind of psychological steadiness, take a moment to like this video. Engagement strengthens the reach of thoughtful discourse in a world that often rewards impulsive reaction. Now, we must move deeper still, for there is another dimension to this problem, one more subtle, and perhaps more difficult. Why do we sometimes tolerate passive aggression longer than we should? Why do intelligent, capable individuals remain entangled in indirect hostility? The answer lies not only in the aggressor's fear, but in our own, and that is where we will turn next. Part 3, on dependency, ego, and the invisible contract. There is a reason why passive aggression unsettles some people more than others. It is not simply the behavior itself. It is the invisible contract beneath it. When subtle hostility disturbs us deeply, it is often because something in us feels at risk. Reputation, approval, belonging, stability, affection, authority, control. passive. Aggression does not attack openly. It destabilizes quietly. And what it destabilizes is not the outer situation, but the inner equilibrium of those who depend on certainty. Imagine a young architect working under a senior partner known for indirect criticism. The partner rarely says, "This design is flawed." Instead, he sighs slightly during presentations. He glances at others before responding. He offers faint praise wrapped in uncertainty. Interesting choice. Bold. The architect begins to doubt himself. He works longer hours. He seeks reassurance from colleagues. He revises projects repeatedly, not because they are wrong, but because he fears the implication of being wrong. Over time, the subtle tension reshapes his behavior more effectively than open criticism ever could. Why? Because he wants approval, because he depends, in part, on the senior partner's validation to feel secure. And this is where Stoic philosophy enters, not as abstract theory, but as strategic insight. Seneca warned that a man who depends on the approval of others becomes their servant, not because others are tyrants by nature, but because dependency grants them influence over your emotional stability. Passive aggression often finds its leverage in precisely this dependency. If you do not require the approval of the one who insinuates, the insinuation loses force. If you do not rely on the emotional warmth of the one who withdraws, the withdrawal weakens. If you do not fear social exclusion, subtle exclusion cannot terrify you. This does not mean one must become indifferent to human connection. Stoicism is not isolation. It is balance. The Stoic values relationships, but he does not anchor his identity in them. Let us return to our architect. At some point he may awaken to a realization. His anxiety is not caused solely by the partner's indirect behavior. It is intensified by his own hunger for affirmation. The partner's sigh unsettles him, not because a sigh is powerful, but because he has granted it authority over his sense of competence. When this becomes clear, a transformation begins. He still observes the partner's behavior. He still recognizes the indirect pattern. But internally, something shifts. He begins grounding his confidence not in external tone, but in objective assessment of his work. He seeks feedback from multiple sources. He strengthens his own criteria for excellence. Gradually, the partner's ambiguity loses its emotional charge. The behavior has not changed. The dependency has, and dependency is often the quiet accomplice in psychological manipulation. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about the importance of self-sufficiency of judgment. He reminded himself that praise and blame are fleeting, that the opinions of others are unstable currents in a larger sea. A ruler who anchored his identity in public approval would govern erratically. A philosopher who anchored his identity in gossip would never think clearly. Likewise, a person who anchors emotional stability in the moods of a passive-aggressive individual will live in perpetual tension. The Stoic does not eliminate emotion. He stabilizes its foundation. There is a deeper layer here. Passive aggression can function as a test. Not a conscious one, perhaps, but a revealing one. It tests how quickly you defend yourself. It tests how desperately you explain. It tests how urgently you seek reassurance. When reassurance is not granted, do you spiral? When clarity is withheld, do you chase? In many cases, the most powerful shift does not occur through confrontation, but through recalibration. Instead of demanding clarity from someone unwilling to provide it, the Stoic strengthens clarity within himself. Instead of insisting on validation from someone inclined to withhold it, he validates himself through alignment with principle. Instead of chasing warmth from someone who weaponizes distance, he reduces his emotional exposure. Notice what is happening. He is not punishing. He is not retaliating. He is not escalating. He is adjusting proximity. This is subtle, but profound. In long-term passive-aggressive dynamics, emotional availability is often asymmetrical. One person seeks resolution. The other avoids it. One seeks transparency. The other survives in ambiguity. If the seeking continues unexamined, exhaustion follows. The Stoic interrupts this pattern by withdrawing the fuel that sustains it, not through hostility, but through composure. There is a story told of a Roman senator who faced political opponents skilled in insinuation. They rarely accused him directly. Instead, they planted doubts in the minds of others. Rather than chasing every rumor, rather than confronting every whisper, he continued acting with visible integrity and declined to engage in speculative defense. When pressed about the insinuations, he reportedly said, "If there is an accusation, let it be made. If not, I will not defend myself against imagination." Over time, the rumors lost energy. The crowd eventually grows bored when a man refuses to perform. Outraged. This does not guarantee that every passive-aggressive individual will mature. Some will persist. Some will escalate. Some will seek other means of control. But what changes decisively is your internal posture. You cease negotiating your worth. You cease over-explaining your position. You cease interpreting silence as indictment. If this realization unsettles you slightly, that is not a failure. It is evidence that something important is being examined. Pause for a moment. Consider whether there are relationships in your life where your discomfort stems less from what is done and more from what you fear losing. Approval, status, affection, belonging. Awareness of dependency is not shameful. It is liberating, and if you are committed to strengthening this inner independence, remain here. Subscribe if you intend to continue studying the architecture of emotional sovereignty. This is not quick advice. It is long-term formation. In the next part, we will examine what happens when passive aggression becomes chronic, when it is no longer an occasional pattern, but a structural feature of a relationship or environment, and how the Stoic determines whether to confront, recalibrate, or depart. Part 4. When the pattern reveals itself, there is a moment in every prolonged conflict when uncertainty gives way to recognition. At first, you are unsure. You tell yourself that perhaps you misread the tone. Perhaps you were too sensitive. Perhaps the silence meant nothing. Perhaps the forgotten task was accidental. But time is patient. And patterns are honest. What appears once may be coincidence. What appears twice may be oversight. What appears repeatedly is structured. It was in this way that a man named Lucius, a minor magistrate in a provincial Roman city, began to understand the temperament of his colleague, Decimus. At first, Decimus seemed agreeable. He never opposed proposals directly. In council meetings, he nodded. He smiled. He offered soft words of support. But when votes were cast, he abstained. When tasks were assigned, his responses arrived late. When projects required coordination, information was withheld just long enough to cause delay. Never enough to accuse. Always enough to complicate. Lucius found himself increasingly unsettled. He questioned whether he was imagining resistance. After all, Decimus never confronted him openly. There were no raised voices, no explicit disagreement. Yet progress stalled. The discomfort was subtle, but persistent, like a stone in the shoe that one tries to ignore while walking. Months passed. Lucius worked harder. He overclarified instructions. He checked and rechecked communications. He sought private reassurance. He adjusted tone. He softened phrasing. None of it altered the pattern. One evening, while reviewing documents alone, Lucius realized something sobering. His energy was no longer devoted to governance. It was devoted to anticipation. He was not leading. He was reacting, and that recognition marked the turning point. The Stoics teach that patience is virtuous, but patience is not the same as permissiveness. Endurance is strength, but endurance without discernment becomes self-sabotage. Marcus Aurelius endured betrayal within his own ranks. Yet he did not pretend it was loyalty. He observed, adjusted, and continued with clarity. Lucius began observing without emotional agitation. He stopped interpreting Decimus' behavior as personal insult. Instead, he recorded it mentally as data, agreement in public, withdrawal in execution, delay under pressure. The pattern was no longer fog. It was architecture, and when something becomes visible, it loses its mystery. This is the critical distinction in chronic passive aggression. The emotional turbulence begins to fade when the pattern becomes undeniable. Many people remain trapped because they refuse to see repetition. They cling to isolated explanations. Perhaps today was different. Perhaps I misunderstood. Perhaps next time will be clearer. But clarity requires courage. Lucius did not confront Decimus immediately. He did something more subtle. He adjusted expectations. He stopped assuming alignment where none existed. He stopped over-investing in cooperative gestures. He reduced reliance on Decimus' timely response. In doing so, he removed the leverage that passive resistance had over his emotional state. Notice what changed. He did not accuse. He did not dramatize. He did not retaliate. He repositioned. The Stoic understands that when a pattern becomes chronic, the question shifts from "how do I feel about this?" to "what structural adjustment is required?" Emotion gives way to strategy. There is a lesson here that many resist. Sometimes the most powerful move is not confrontation, it is recalibration. If someone consistently communicates indirectly, you respond only to what is explicit. If someone consistently delays, you build timelines that do not depend solely on them. If someone consistently withholds clarity, you reduce your reliance on their clarity. This is not hostility. It is intelligent design. Epictetus taught that one must concern oneself with what lies within one's control. Another person's communication style is not within your control. Your positioning and response to it is. Lucius, having recalibrated, noticed something unexpected. The emotional tension that once consumed him diminished. Decimus' behavior continued, but it no longer destabilized him. without emotional reaction. The subtle resistance lost its psychological edge. Eventually, Decimus attempted a more direct insinuation in council. Some leaders moved too quickly, perhaps without sufficient consultation. Lucius did not defend himself. He responded calmly. If there is a specific concern about a recent decision, I invite it openly. Silence followed. Not because Decimus was defeated, but because ambiguity had been deprived of oxygen. If you are listening to this and recognizing a pattern in your own life, perhaps in your workplace, your family, your partnerships, do not rush to anger. Do not rush to accusation. Observe. Is it isolated, or is it structural? And if it is structural, ask yourself not, how do I win? But how do I reposition? This distinction separates reaction from mastery. Take a moment now. If this narrative has illuminated something that was previously fog, write in the comments, I see the pattern. Because seeing clearly is the first act of strength. And if you intend to continue building this kind of strategic composure, subscribe not for affirmation, but for formation. What we are cultivating here is not entertainment. It is steadiness. In the next part, we will move into the art of directness, how the Stoic names patterns without rage, without humiliation, and without surrendering dignity. For there comes a time when silence must yield to clarity, and clarity, when delivered properly, is more powerful than anger. Part 5, the discipline of directness. There comes a moment in certain conflicts when observation is no longer sufficient. The pattern has been seen. The recalibration has been made. The emotional reaction has been mastered. Yet the atmosphere remains unstable. It is at this moment that many people falter. Some explode in accumulated frustration. Others retreat permanently into avoidance. Very few choose the third path, disciplined directness. The Stoics were not timid men. They were not silent sufferers of injustice. What distinguished them was not silence, but proportion. They spoke when speech served clarity. They withheld speech when speech served ego. Lucius, having observed Decimus for months, reached such a moment. The council's progress was repeatedly slowed by indirect resistance. The recalibration had protected Lucius internally. But the structural friction remained. One afternoon, after a session marked by another ambiguous remark, Lucius requested a private conversation. He did not enter the room rehearsing accusations. He entered it with composure. Decimus, he began, I have noticed a pattern. In public discussions, you often express agreement. In execution, I observe hesitation. If there is disagreement, I prefer it directly. There was no raised voice, no theatrical intensity. Just clarity. This is where many misunderstand confrontation. They imagine it must be dramatic to be effective, but drama signals emotional overflow. Clarity signals authority. Decimus, accustomed to operating in ambiguity, hesitated. His power rested in implication. Now implication had been named without hostility. I do not mean to obstruct, he replied. Lucius did not argue. He did not accuse. He simply added, then let us ensure that when disagreement arises, it is spoken plainly. It will strengthen our work. Notice the structure. Observation. Preference. Invitation. No insult. No humiliation. No escalation. The Stoic does not confront to wound. He confronts to illuminate. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best way to deal with wrongdoing is not to mirror it. If someone operates indirectly, do not descend into indirect warfare. If someone hints, do not hint back. If someone withholds clarity, do not retaliate with obscurity. Directness is not aggression. It is alignment. Yet this kind of speech requires internal preparation. Without prior emotional discipline, directness becomes disguised resentment. The tone betrays the tension beneath it. This is why earlier stages were necessary. You cannot speak calmly about a pattern if you are still personally wounded by it. The Stoic prepares himself inwardly before speaking. Outwardly, there is a scene described in ancient accounts of Cato the Younger, known for his uncompromising integrity. When confronted with political maneuvering, he did not engage in rumor or subtext. He addressed matters openly, often to the discomfort of those who preferred ambiguity. Cato understood that clarity isolates the manipulator. When you say calmly, "If you disagree, I would rather hear it directly," you are not attacking. You are setting a standard, and standards reveal character. Some individuals will rise to meet clarity. Others will retreat further into subtlety. Either response provides information. If clarity is rejected repeatedly, the Stoic draws conclusions without bitterness. There is a difference between offering opportunity for directness and demanding transformation. You may invite clarity. You cannot force maturity. Pause here. Consider whether in your own life there are conversations that have been postponed because you fear escalation. Ask yourself whether the postponement has preserved peace or prolonged instability. If this reflection is stirring resolve within you, write in the comments, "I choose directness." Directness is not harshness. It is courage without aggression. And if you are committed to cultivating this kind of composure before difficult conversations, remain with this channel. Subscribe not as a gesture, but as a declaration that you intend to practice what you are learning. Let us go deeper. There is another layer to disciplined directness that is often overlooked. It is brevity. When confronting passive aggression, the untrained mind explains excessively. It offers history, justification, emotional context, supporting arguments. But excess explanation signals insecurity. The Stoic speaks plainly and stops. If there is disagreement, let it be stated clearly. Silence. He does not fill the air with nervous elaboration. He does not defend against hypothetical accusations. He allows the weight of clarity to stand on its own. This brevity unsettles those accustomed to emotional negotiation. And yet, it stabilizes the one who practices it. In the weeks following Lucius' conversation with Decimus, something subtle shifted. The indirect comments decreased. Not entirely, but noticeably. Why? Because ambiguity thrives where it is unchallenged. Once gently exposed, it becomes less comfortable to sustain. Not every story ends this way. Some individuals double down on subtle hostility when confronted. If that occurs, the Stoic does not panic. He simply moves to the next phase, strategic distance. But before distance, there must be clarity. Without clarity, withdrawal feels like defeat. With clarity, withdrawal becomes decision. And decision restores sovereignty. Take a moment now. If you have been tolerating ambiguity out of fear of conflict, Consider whether calm directness might serve you better than continued silence. And if you are serious about embodying this steadiness, not occasionally, but consistently, support this work. Like this video. Share it with someone who avoids necessary conversations. Let this philosophy reach beyond you. In the next part, we will examine strategic distance, the art of reducing access without drama, of withdrawing energy without hostility, and of protecting sovereignty without bitterness. For there are times when clarity is offered and still rejected, and at that moment the Stoic does not escalate, he adjusts. Proximity. Part 6. Strategic. Distance and the governance of energy. There are conflicts that resolve through clarity, and there are conflicts that reveal something more enduring, a difference not merely of opinion, but of character. When disciplined directness has been offered and ambiguity persists, the Stoic faces a different question. It is no longer, how do I correct this? It becomes, how do I position myself wisely within it? This is where many misunderstand Stoicism. They imagine endurance means remaining fully exposed to every corrosive pattern. They confuse strength with tolerance of dysfunction. But the Stoics did not confuse self-control with self-sacrifice. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire. He did not grant equal access to every voice within it. He listened broadly, but he relied selectively. Influence was calibrated. So too must energy be calibrated. Let us return to Lucius. After his private conversation with Decimus, there was a period of relative steadiness. Yet gradually the familiar pattern resurfaced, not dramatically, but persistently. Agreements were offered in public. Hesitations appeared in execution. Lucius observed without agitation. He had already confronted calmly. He had already invited directness. The repetition was no longer ambiguous. At this stage, many would escalate. They would expose the pattern publicly. They would gather allies. They would convert subtle tension into open rivalry. Lucius did not. He adjusted distance. He reduced reliance on decisions for critical tasks. He diversified collaboration. He shortened communication chains. He stopped oversharing plans that required seamless cooperation. Externally, nothing dramatic occurred. There were no declarations of distrust, no theatrical withdrawal. Internally, however, a boundary had been established. This is strategic distance. It is not coldness. It is not revenge. It is intelligent containment. Passive aggression often functions as a slow drain of energy. The constant need to interpret, to anticipate, to compensate. This erodes focus. The Stoic recognizes that energy is finite. To squander it on patterns unlikely to mature is imprudent. Epictetus taught that we must concern ourselves with what is within our control. Access is often within our control. Proximity is often within our control. Exposure is often within our control. We cannot force another's communication style to evolve, but we can determine how much of our stability we place in their hands. There is a profound dignity in quiet recalibration. Consider a modern scenario. A manager repeatedly uses subtle sarcasm in meetings. It is never overt enough to formally challenge. When addressed privately, the manager denies ill intent. The pattern continues. The employee, having attempted clarity, now faces a choice. One option is escalation, emotional confrontation, complaint. public exposure. Another option is resignation into silent resentment. The Stoic path is different. The employee begins documenting interactions. He reduces voluntary vulnerability in meetings. He prepares responses that are concise and neutral. He builds relationships with other departments. He strengthens his professional autonomy. He does not retaliate. He fortifies. Gradually, the manager's indirect remarks lose their destabilizing effect. Without visible reaction, without excessive explanation, without dependency, the subtle attacks land on stone. Strategic distance is often invisible to others. It is primarily an internal shift that gradually manifests outwardly. There is an ancient metaphor in Stoic literature of the inner citadel, a fortified place within the self that remains unconquered. Strategic distance is the architectural expansion of that citadel. You do not barricade the gates violently. You simply narrow the entrance. Now pause. Consider whether there is someone in your life whose proximity consistently costs you clarity. Ask yourself whether you have been trying to fix the dynamic when a quieter adjustment might serve you better. Write in the comments, I govern my energy. Energy governance is not selfishness. It is stewardship. And if you intend to practice this kind of composure, this refusal to be dragged into endless subtext, subscribe. Mastery is not achieved in a single insight. It is cultivated through repetition. There is, however, a final layer: distance, clarity, recalibration. These are powerful. But the ultimate Stoic strength does not depend on environment. It depends on identity. Because if your identity remains vulnerable to insult, to insinuation, to exclusion, then even from a distance, you may still feel unsettled. The final transformation lies not in managing others. It lies in becoming internally unoffendable. That is where we go next, and it is the summit. Part 7. The state of being unoffendable is a level of composure that no strategy can produce on its own. You may learn to pause before reacting. You may learn to request clarity. You may learn to adjust proximity, but unless something deeper shifts within you, subtle hostility will continue to find its mark. The final transformation is not tactical. It is existential. The Stoics understood that insult only wounds where insecurity already resides. A comment touches only the surface that is sensitive. A suggestion destabilizes only where identity is uncertain. Epictetus, who was born a slave and lived under physical control for much of his early life, taught something radical. No one can truly harm your character unless you permit it. External words, gestures, or silences do not define you. Only your judgments and your actions do. This is not a denial of emotional reality. It is a recalibration of authority. When someone implies incompetence, the untrained mind rushes to defend because it fears incompetence may be true. When someone withdraws warmth, the untrained mind chases because it fears abandonment. When someone hints at disrespect, the untrained mind reacts because it fears diminished status. But the Stoic asks a quieter question: is my character intact? If the answer is yes, then implication loses its power. Imagine a seasoned general standing before a young officer who attempts subtle mockery in front of the ranks. The general does not snap. He does not counter with humiliation. He does not attempt to restore dominance theatrically. He simply continues speaking as if nothing essential has shifted. Why? Because nothing essential has shifted. The mockery does not threaten his competence. It does not diminish his discipline. It does not alter his integrity. He is anchored. Anchoring is the core of unoffendability. That is not that you feel nothing. It is that feeling does not dictate your sense of self. Marcus Aurelius wrote that if someone insults you, the best response is to consider whether it is true. If it is true, correct yourself. If it is false, why be disturbed? This seems simple when written. It is profound when practiced. Most emotional injury occurs because we interpret implication as verdict. A subtle comment feels like a judgment. A delay feels like rejection. A sigh feels like condemnation. The Stoic refuses to elevate implication into verdict. He examines it. If there is truth, he adjusts calmly. If there is none, he releases it. This discipline requires practice. It requires repeated internal dialogue. It requires catching the mind before it constructs elaborate narratives around minor stimuli. Let us return once more to Lucius. Years after his conflict with Decimus, Lucius faced a different adversary, a rival who was openly critical, yet occasionally laced his criticism with insinuation about Lucius' motives. The younger Lucius might have reacted. He might have felt compelled to defend his integrity vigorously. The older Lucius, having matured, responded differently. He listened. He assessed whether any portion of the criticism contained truth. Where it did, he adjusted. Where it did not, he remained unmoved. He did not seek to silence his rival. He did not attempt to outmaneuver him rhetorically. He did not invest energy in correcting every subtle barb. His identity was no longer negotiable. That is the difference. Passive. Aggression loses potency in the presence of someone who does not seek to be affirmed by the aggressor. It loses power. In the presence of someone who does not fear misunderstanding. It loses leverage. In the presence of someone who has made peace with imperfection. To become unoffendable is not to become indifferent to justice. It is not to tolerate abuse silently. It is to remove ego from the equation. When ego diminishes, manipulation struggles to attach itself. Pause here. Consider the last time you felt subtly disrespected. Ask yourself what part of you felt threatened. Reputation? Competence? Belonging? Pride? Now ask a harder question. If that aspect of identity were secure within you, would the comment have carried the same weight? Write in the comments, my character is not negotiable. Not as arrogance, but as grounding. And if you intend to cultivate this internal anchoring deliberately, subscribe. Not because subscription itself transforms you, but because sustained exposure to disciplined thought shapes the mind. There is one final insight to leave you with. The Stoic does not measure victory by silencing others. He measures victory by remaining stable within himself. You may encounter passive-aggressive individuals again. You may face insinuation, withdrawal, indirect resistance. But if you have trained perception, recalibrated dependency, practiced directness, governed proximity, and anchored identity, you will not be drawn into fog. You will see it. And seeing clearly is freedom. If this discourse has shifted something within you, do not let it fade into passive agreement. Reflect on it tonight. Revisit moments in your own history. Identify patterns without resentment. And share this with someone who is entangled in subtle conflict. Let philosophy become practical. The Stoics were not unfeeling. They were unshaken, and that steadiness remains available to you. There is still a kind of conflict that leaves no visible scars. It still arrives quietly. It still smiles. It still hides inside polite words and ambiguous silences. But now you see it differently. At the beginning of this discourse, we spoke of fog, of the exhaustion that comes from fighting what cannot be clearly named. We spoke of the mental courtroom, of replayed conversations, of the subtle erosion of peace. What has changed is not the existence of that fog. What has changed is you. The fog is only dangerous to the one who rushes into it blindly, the one who stands still, who waits for clarity, who refuses to animate implication with imagination. That one is not consumed. Passive aggression still exists. It will continue to exist. There will always be those who hit instead of speak, withdraw instead of confront, imply instead of declare. But the question was never how to eliminate them. The question was how to remain sovereign in their presence. You have seen that reaction fuels ambiguity. You have seen that dependency grants leverage. You have seen that clarity disarms implication. You have seen that distance can protect energy. And above all, you have seen that identity anchored in virtue cannot be negotiated by tone or silence. The invisible war loses its power when the battlefield is no longer inside you. If someone suggests your inadequacy, you examine yourself calmly. If someone withdraws approval, you remain grounded. If someone hints at criticism, you invite precision. If precision never comes, you do not pursue shadows. This is not coldness. It is composure. This is not arrogance. It is alignment. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself that no man can harm his character unless he allows it. That insight is not poetic. It is practical. When you no longer seek validation from the ambiguous, their ambiguity cannot destabilize you. When you no longer fear misunderstanding, insinuation cannot intimidate you. When you no longer negotiate your worth, silence cannot threaten you. The war that once exhausted you becomes a quiet theater in which you simply observe. And observation, when disciplined, becomes freedom. Pause for a moment. Think back to the opening image, the subtle conflict, the smiling hostility, the heavy silence. Now imagine facing that same situation tomorrow. Not with anger, not with over-explanation, not with anxiety, but with stillness. With measured speech, with calibrated distance, with anchored identity. That is what has been built here. If you intend to carry this discipline forward, not just intellectually, but practically, remain engaged in this work. Subscribe if you are committed to mastering yourself in environments that test you. Like this reflection, if you believe calm is stronger than dominance. And in the comments, write one final declaration. I remain steady, not because others have changed, but because you have. Stoics were not immune to difficult people. They were immune to losing themselves in their presence. And that steadiness, quiet, unshaken, sovereign, is now within your reach. Stay disciplined, stay observant, stay immovable.